Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the second DSA CalGreen for Schools workshop. We appreciate everybody's attendance. All of those who could overcome the link mishap. We are working to get that distributed to everybody. If there are others that you are aware of, we're going to attend within your district or sphere of influence, go ahead and forward them your informal way of having been able to overcome those shortcomings on the link. And I believe it's pasting the URL into your browser will get you here, but for some reason the link misdirected you to the previous meeting. So if you've overcome that, we appreciate you joining us here on this great Friday. It is beautiful weather outside, so I know that everybody's time is important, and you probably have maybe more pleasant things to do than attend a public meeting, but we appreciate your time. It is important and very vital for our process to have really strong involvement with the public, and appreciate you taking the time today to spend with us. The agenda was posted, and I will simply start with a few administrative things. The chat function is available. However, we prefer, and I realize people are probably still going to be checking in after this, but we would prefer a raised hand once questions are, in order to ask your question. We will be addressing questions after items 4, and then after items 5A, after item 5B, after, 5B and item 5C, and then after item 6. So essentially after each of the proposed amendment sections, and by section, I mean topic. Look forward to raising your hand at that point. If you are calling in, I believe it is *9. In a previous meeting, we did experience some difficulty in that functionality with Zoom. So please be patient. If *9 does not operate, then feel free to speak up your name, and we will try to get to you after the raised hands on the Zoom. We will go to call-in questions. So with that, I will mention again that we are recording. You should have had that notification on the Zoom, but in case you did not notice it, we are recording this meeting, and we'll utilize it for both for our benefit and for public record, of course. Again, it is September 30th. We started a little bit late, about 9:07. I appreciate everybody being here. Without further ado, I'll move on to the agenda items, which is introduction of DSA HQ sustainability staff. My name is Eric Drever. I'm principal architect over architectural codes and policies, and part of my responsibilities are to oversee our sustainability group, among other things, such as fire life safety, accessibility, our CAS program. But sustainability is primarily what we're here to talk about today, with the one outlier being the plumbing code. So we wanted to make sure that item gets addressed, and it was most expeditious to include it in this CalGreen workshop, as we did in the first CalGreen workshop. I will introduce, or allow Ida Claire to introduce herself. You're muted, Ida.
Hi, everyone. Ida Claire, state architect. I'm so happy to see quite a crowd today. We're pleased to present our advancements in CalGreen and our commitment to advancing school sustainability. As always, if you have any questions, you can reach out to me via email. Today, I'm basically listening in, passing the torch to the sustainability team in Ericville. Thanks.
Thanks, Ida. Mickey, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Michelle Golden. I'm a senior architect with the sustainability team in headquarters, and I will be presenting today. Paul?
And Paul?
I'm Paul Johnson. I'm a senior electrical engineer, and I'll be presenting the EVCS today.
Thank you, Paul. And manning all of the administrative duties seamlessly is Jessica.
Hi, I'm
Good.
Jessica Axman, and I'm sorry for all the issues this morning.
You're doing great, thank you. Not with us today on the Zoom meeting is Tab Cummins. He's our senior mechanical engineer in sustainability, and Katie Iverson, who also normally assists Jessica, is not with us as well. Appreciate everybody being here. There is I see a growing number of folks. We're up to about 40 participants. So in the interest of time, and considering the amount of folks here, I think we'll skip past individual introductions to all the attendees. If you'd like to ever discuss anything with us, my email is eric.drever@dgs.ca.gov. I'm happy to correspond in either a phone call or an email. So we'll just forego any formal introductions of all the attendees. And I believe I can share my screen at this point. Okay, let's make sure. Can I get a couple of quick raised hands to make sure that you can see my screen? And as I work to see the rest of this meeting. I apologize. I'm trying to maximize my screen on the other side so that I can see everything else. So in front of you should be I see raised hands, so thank you for that. You can go ahead and lower your hands. Is the agenda. So we've gone over item 1. We'll move on to item number 2, the 2022 Building Standards Intervening Code Cycle Schedule. So I'll switch quickly over to that. We are here essentially, and maybe slightly to the right of where the X is. We're getting pretty close to submitting initially our initial express terms, which we'll share with you today, to DSA and legal and finance. Excuse me, not to DSA, to DGS, legal and finance. And in those express terms, we will include a number of rulemaking documents, including financial analysis, but most importantly, the express terms, which we'll share with you today, as well as our, which we're not prepared to share today, but the statement of reasons, which are in preparation. I think primarily of primary importance to you, to this group, is certainly the specific language that is going to be proposed coming in December. So officially that gets submitted to Building Standards Commission in December. In order to do that, we have internal review processes that to verify that the language is correct, that the statement of reasons is correct, that the financial analysis is all correct prior to going to Building Standards Commission for their review. So we are here pretty early in the process. It is considered a pre-cycle rulemaking. Once we submit to Building Standards, it will go into the code advisory committees, and there will be a series of meetings to cover those through the code advisory committees. And those are managed by Building Standards Commission, who I believe is, at least Enrique is on the call today. I'm not sure who else might be on the call, but I think Mia will be checking in and out periodically. From there, it goes into the public review process. There'll be a 45-day review period, then a 15-day review period, and ultimately all of that moves into adoption, and then will become published, and then the effective date will be for these provisions, or what these provisions ultimately become, will become effective January 1, 2024. So there is still a long ways to go. We still will continue to receive public input throughout the process up until the adoption date, after which then it'll publish and become effective later in mid 2024. Let me go back to the agenda. Summary, so that's essentially our schedule for the intervening code cycle. And you should be aware that the 2022 triennial, the model code adoption plus California amendments for the California Building Standards codes will become effective January 1, 2023. So that's just, essentially 2 months around the corner. And those requirements within CalGreen were not great, but there certainly were some updates. And the model code language, or excuse me, the express terms language that we'll be presenting today are modifications or amendments to the 2022 triennial code. Again, so if you're familiar with the code cycle, is we adopt the triennial code every 3 years for its name. And that is essentially the model code with California amendments. And then we add in another intervening schedule, which I just described, which essentially is an 18-month schedule of code adoption. So let me just jump to the CalGreen 2022 triennial code updates that were included. So in that, and I'm just going to go through these fairly quickly. These have been adopted, published, and again will become effective in January. But there were some clarifications on shade tree requirements. CO2 monitors for new classrooms were added to the CalGreen code, which ultimately we'll cover some amendments to that a little bit later. And then VOC limits for thermal insulation and acoustic tile ceilings were added to the list of other materials which have VOC limits as well, but those two specific materials were added. And then one of the larger updates to CalGreen in the 2022 triennial cycle was a requirement for EVC installation infrastructure, which does include charger installation at the time of construction. So for the first time, charging was required, and 20% of total new parking areas are required to be provided with EV infrastructure. So that term is EV capable, and it is primarily just the infrastructure to a space. Now, 25% of those spaces are required to have EV capable spaces are required to be provided with a charger, and that is EVSEs, electric vehicle service equipment. So those are brand new to the 2022 and will be required as of January 1, 2023. And that is for new construction. Let me head back to the agenda. Steps to date. So if you're here for the first time, then perhaps you weren't at our first workshop, our CalGreen for Schools workshop last month. And that is one of the steps that we took, where we introduced many of the concepts that you'll see today have grown into actual express terms or code language. We'll present those, or Paul and Mickey will present those updates. But that was perhaps the most recent step. But we've also, DSA is partnered with Building Standards Commission as well as HCD on two very important collaboratives, which have helped to define the language that you'll see today. One is the EVCS, which has been advanced or being advanced, and initially it started as a co-adoption, but DSA recognizing that there were distinct differences, and some of that was based upon input we received at our first workshop. DSA recognized the distinct use patterns on schools are different from many of the other non-residential uses. And so what started as a co-adoption with BSC has grown into more specific DSA schools specific requirements that we'll introduce in a bit. And then the other collaborative that we were part of is the Carbon Reduction Collaborative, again with BSC and HCD. Very strong involvement in both of those collaboratives. I would say that having attended other collaborations and public meetings with DSA even prior to me coming here, these two collaboratives, the folks involved were simply tirelessly working on all of the input that we gave, specific language, comments. That it was a very, very active group, both of them, and really greatly appreciate all of the input that we got. For the carbon reduction, we will be co-adopting, or we plan to co-adopt the carbon reduction requirements for non-residential facilities, and Mickey will present those later. Those are the two primary, I guess I should say three primary pre-cycle activities that we've been involved with, and look forward to moving this public comment, receiving public comment in the rulemaking cycles. So before I move on, I promised we would take questions after items 1 through 4. Are there any questions? I don't see any hand raises. Well, I hope I haven't bored you to death, so hopefully you'll stay tuned. Mickey and Paul will do a great job. Are there any calls, Jessica?
It looks like we do have one caller.
And is that a question with the caller, or?
No, I'm just letting you know that we do have one caller on the
Okay.
one call in.
Great. So yeah, and I see that. So if you have a question, whomever that might be, feel free to hit *9 if you would like to post a comment or have a question, and we will make sure to get to you. So with that, I will again introduce Paul Johnson, our electrical engineer, and he will cover the EVCS portions of the express terms.
Eric, we actually do have a hand raised, so.
Great. Joe Vila.
Just real quickly, you mentioned that the chat was available, but I do not see it here available to use. Just thought I'd let you know.
Thank you.
Yeah, they are correct. I don't see a chat either.
Okay. It was available earlier to me, or I should say, actually, I'll correct Joe. I saw the button, I just didn't press the button, so I'm not sure if it was actually active or not. So we will depend on raised hands in lieu of chat. So if you do have a comment, please raise your hand, or if you're calling in, hit *9. Fair enough? All right, thank you. So without further ado, I'll let Paul take it away. Thanks, Paul. I'll stop share and maybe you can share them.
Yeah, let me know if you can see my screen.
We can, thank you.
Okay. So based on our last workshop, we made a number of revisions to our initial express terms, and we posted them for comment. And so a lot of the revisions that we've made, we're moving language from one section to another. We created a DSA specific section for EV charging. And with that, creating that section, so we included all that existing language that had already been codified, but we also realized that we hadn't done a school-specific workshop for much of the language that was included in the 2022 intervening cycle, not intervening cycle, but triennial cycle. And so we included that language on this express terms. And so some of that I'll go through quickly. If you have a comment on it, though, we would love to hear it, because we didn't do it for school specific. We workshopped it in a joint workshop with BSC last time. I don't think we got any or very many, if any, comments from school specific participants. So item 1 of our initial express terms includes the definitions. And I'm not going to go through these definitions at the top. These are existing codified definitions, but if you do have a comment on them, feel free to make that. And so our language that has changed in the express terms is all underlined. And so these 2 definitions that we are adding are level 1 electric EV charging receptacles are a 120 volt, 20 amp minimum branch circuit and a receptacle. And again, we'll get into the reason why we're adding these definitions later, but we'll just go over them now. So low power level 2 electric vehicle charging receptacle, a 208, 240 volt, 20 amp minimum branch circuit and a receptacle. Level 2 electric vehicle supply equipment, the 208, 240 volt, 40 amp branch circuit and electric vehicle charging connectors, attachment plugs and all other fittings, devices, power outlets, or apparatus installed specifically for the purpose of transferring energy between the premises wiring and the electric vehicle. So moving on to, and so again, we'll take questions for all of the EV charging at the end of the express terms when I'm done presenting that. So item number 2 is the scoping of the code or the language that we have. And so we are adding section 5016.12, 5016.5.6.5 for additions and alterations, and then 501.6.5.6 again to additions and alterations. And then the final one on there, 301.4.2.7 will be presented later. So item number 3. So this is the language that we have added to and changed. And so again, you can see we took existing code language from 5016.5.3 and created a DSA public school specific language in 5016.5.6. And so much of this is not going to be underlined because it is existing language that has already been codified and approved. We did do some language cleanup. As you can see, we got rid of construction to provide other cleanup as well. I'm not going to necessarily go over the cleanup unless there was a substantial change. So the exceptions, and this is a big thing that we saw, that we felt like we got from the workshop specifically last time, is worry about issues arising when having to add chargers. And so this language we've changed a lot, and we specifically said and added that these exceptions and or that installing EVSE has some exceptions. And we changed that specifically to say with the authority having jurisdiction or the local enforcement agency to DSA specific. And so those exceptions are where there's no local utility power, where the local utility power is unable to supply adequate power, or, and so exception C, we've gotten rid of and created a new one, the installation of EVCS is impracticable. Now, all those exceptions have to be brought before DSA and given concurrence. So if you have issues installing chargers, if you think, hey, I can't get power out there, this is going to cost, it's going to be cost prohibitive to the project, bring it to us. We'll work with you and try to figure out an equitable solution. So again, most of the changes are changing the location of the existing code into the new DSA specific code. So on table 5106.5.6.1, we're changing one of the notes, and that to make it easier to understand the table. And so note number 2 is saying each EVCS, so each electric vehicle charging station, shall reduce the number of required EV capable spaces by the same number. So column number 3 is supposed to reduce column number 2, the number of required spaces in column number 2. So if you install 9 spaces in here, you would install 9 less than the 35. So 5016.5.6.3 is the first new code language in our section. And so this is an alternative compliance method. And so in lieu of compliance with section 5016.5.6.2, which is the table specifying how many chargers you have to install, specifically level 2 or DCFC chargers, this is an alternative section or an alternative way to compliance. And so EVCS shall be provided with level 1 power or level 1, low power level 2, or level 2, or any combination of level 1, low power level 2, or level 2 EVSE, such that the total power supplied by the combination of EVSE meets the minimum power indicated in table 5016.5.6.3, based on the total, and this is based on the total number of actual parking spaces in the facility. And so then we have table 5016.5.6.3, which indicates the number of spaces and the number of kVA, or the total kVA required to be added to the parking lot. And so by using this method, but the power method, as we're calling it, you can choose what's best for your facility, whether it's a small facility or a large facility or a community college where you need more higher level charging. And this gives the flexibility, which from our survey that we conducted, we found that most people wanted the flexibility to install what they felt was best for each campus. And then at the end, we have an equation. So for 201 spaces and over, there's an equation for you to figure out how much kVA is required for that parking lot. And so we went over that a little bit last time. And so this next language is something that we did not go over. We got input. At the end of our last workshop, we asked for input on additions and alterations and how to best get EVCS installed in those. And so this language comes from a lot of that input. So 5.106.5.6.4, EVCS for alterations of or additions to existing parking facilities. Alterations of or additions to existing parking facilities shall provide EVCS in compliance with section 5106.5, which is the normal route that you would go if installing the parking lot. The installation of infrastructure only for EV capable spaces without EVSE required by table 5106.5.6.1 shall not be required for alterations of and additions to parking facilities. 5106.5.6.4.1 alterations of and additions to parking facilities. EVCS shall be provided in accordance with the number indicated in table 5106.5 or 0.6.1 or minimum power indicated in table 5106.5.6.3. When the scope of work includes an increase in the power supply to an electric panel serving light fixtures illuminated in the parking area, or when parking spaces are added to an existing facility, the number of required EVCS shall be based on the total number of existing and new parking spaces in the parking facility. So we're allowing you to go either use the original method or the alternative method based on power. And then we're saying if the panel that's serving the parking facility, the lights in the facility, you would have to also add charging at that time. Additionally, 5106.5.6.4.2, alterations consisting of the installation of photovoltaic systems. EVCS shall be provided in accordance with the number indicated in table 5106.5.6.1 or maximum power indicated in table 5106.5.6.3 when a new photovoltaic system is installed in an existing parking facility. To us, this was a fairly simple ask because when you're adding PV into a parking area, you're likely doing electrical infrastructure upgrades as well as trenching in the parking lot. So we felt this would be a very low cost adder on the infrastructure and the trenching. And then 5106.5.5.5. requirements to install EVCS. EVSE shall be provided in all existing EV capable spaces to create EVCS when a project is required by California Administrative Code Section 4309 to be submitted for plan approval to the Division of the State Architect. When additional spaces are added to existing parking facilities, they shall meet the requirements of new parking facilities found in 5106.5.6.1. Existing EV capable space infrastructure can be used to meet this requirement. So, and then we have an exception. Projects consisting of accessibility improvements only are not required to comply with this section. And so we know that there's not a lot in school facilities, there's not going to be a lot of EV capable spaces. So the 2019 code required EV capable spaces, just the infrastructure to be installed. And so this is our way of saying, hey, if you're doing a project that by code or by section, Administrative Code Section 4309 has to be submitted for plan review or plan approval to DSA, then we're going to ask you to take the existing infrastructure that was installed for these EV capable spaces and the panel capacity that was set aside and install EVSE to create the EV charging spaces or stations. And then finally, 5106.5.6.6, accessible EVCS. When EVSE is installed, accessible EVCS shall be provided in accordance with California Building Code Chapter 11B. So that is the EVCS code that we have, and we are now open for comments.
If you'd like to comment, please raise your hand and we'll take questions in the order of raised hands. Enrique, go ahead and unmute.
Yeah, yeah, good morning, everyone. Enrique Rodriguez, Associate Construction Analyst with the California Building Standards Commission. Paul, I do have I have two questions, and one pertains to I noticed. Can you go up to the definition of electric vehicle charging stations? Well, I would say the DSA proposal. I guess the question is DSA proposing to amend electric vehicle charging stations to add the comma and receptacles that was discussed in our CALGreen electric vehicle workshop number 4 meeting, September 22nd, and based on the coordination meeting that we had yesterday with other state agencies. And I don't see that amendment in here.
Yeah, so we initially thought we were not going to do it, but after the meetings, specifically the meeting yesterday, we have to have some more internal discussion
Okay.
on that. So I did, after our meeting yesterday, I did a lot more research on that. And so,
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. That was one.
Enrique, can I maybe pause on that? Because it's an important point I'd like to maybe clarify.
Okay.
So these proposals were posted and made available to the public. So we felt it was important that some of the, there are ongoing updates to the carbon reduction. There was a meeting that occurred yesterday. So there will continue to be small modifications to these up until the deadline. But in order to not confuse the issue, since it was posted publicly, we felt it was important to at least present what was published.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And so I guess, yeah, my question is, DSA is going to be considered to add the amendment that we agreed. Well,
Yeah. Yes.
yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that is
Yeah,
our intention. That isn't our intention, among other minor edits to the documents as well. But
okay. And now the only reason I mention it, it might be appropriate to maybe I guess let the folks on the call know that that might be a potential change, and I don't know if they have comments pertaining to that.
Sure,
That's the only
absolutely. Paul, maybe you
ask.
could go into a little bit of detail why that's an important term to introduce into the definition.
Okay, so yeah, if we can go up to the main definition, the electric vehicle charging station definition. Yeah, so right there. So BSC is proposing to, after the word electric vehicle chargers, to add a actually let me look at the document that we discussed yesterday, and I can tell you what that looks like. Let's see. Yeah, so the proposal is to change the definition for electric vehicle charging stations to read as follows: one or more electric vehicle charging spaces served by an electric vehicle charger or chargers or receptacle or receptacles for EV charging. So basically simplify that definition and mainly add the word or receptacle. And the reason that we need the word receptacle in the definition for EVCS is that the level 2 definition and low power level 2 have the words receptacle in the definition. And in case for DSA, their level 1 also has charger in the actual definition. So the idea was to tie the either level 1, level 2, or low power level 2 chargers, when installed, they become they basically create an electric vehicle charging station. So the idea was to tie the word receptacle back to the electric vehicle charging stations. So that's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Enrique. Paul, do you have any further clarification on that?
Yeah, so yeah, and so when we were looking at this and adding it to that, I didn't think that was necessarily important. I'm thinking that it may now be, just based on all the definitions we have. So I don't think that substantially changes anything in the code. But yes, there may be some edits that happen, and based on comments we get today or before we post, we may have, I mean, a lot of edits. So, but again, this is a workshop.
Yeah.
And when we post our language, which we'll send out to everyone, if you're on this meeting, you'll get an invite to that. And you can again comment on the final language.
Yeah, and I really kind of wanted to stress trying to have the state agencies coordinate as much as possible whenever possible, so we don't have a bunch of banners from the different state agencies on a definition that could have been coordinated. So we just want to make sure that we look into that. And then actually, I do have one last question, Paul, and that had to do with the alternative compliance method. I noticed that, and this may I just want maybe the folks on the line to be aware. So if somebody chooses the alternative compliance method, it's basically requiring just electric vehicle charging stations and no EV capable spaces. And I just wanted to make sure that that was clear.
Yes, that's our intent, is to move forward on eliminating the capable spaces. And so a lot of what we did, especially moving our section, breaking away from VSC and then the non-res, was in preparation for that in the next triennial cycle.
Got it. And then also looking at somebody was to choose the second option, or the power allocation option, there's more power required for option 1, which is the EV capable space table, than the table 106.5.6.3 that is power based. Okay.
Yes.
Great. Yeah, I just wanted to comment on that. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Enrique.
Mia, you're next.
Hey, good morning. Thanks for the coordination on this. It's great. I only had one other thought about what may impact DSA with adding the receptacles into that definition, is I think that defined term, electric vehicle charging station, is used in chapter 11B. And so that's the other link to this too. And I know DSA's thought about that a little bit. So that's the rub there is when you introduce that word into the definition, how does that translate into the use of 11B? So those are just some ongoing things I think that have to be discussed as well.
Thank you, Mia.
Thank you.
Doesn't look like there's any other hands up right now.
Okay. Oh, you have one.
Janet, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thanks. I had a comment about the alternative way of complying as well. We talked last time about distance places, and maybe this is the impracticable portion of it. But if we've met the number of parking spaces in a more accessible area to the public, not having to put it into back parking lots, would that fall under the practicable one definition?
Yeah, so we had a lot of talk about that. I think, yeah, it does. It falls under the impractical. We initially said something about remote parking, and then maybe adding it to somewhere close, but I think that was part of the impracticable.
Okay.
So if you have issues like that, come to us, talk to us. We'll figure out the best solution possible. What we fear is someone saying, "Hey, it's remote," but it's not really remote. So we'd rather have people come to us, talk to us, and then we can approve that.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Janet, the other item B there also that should be on the screen also feathers into that discussion as well. So if it's remote and you can't get power to it, then certainly that's a consideration as well for an exception.
Okay, well, we usually have light poles out there, but we don't necessarily have supervision at all times during the day, and we would want to have these in an area where they could be watched. I mean, they're parking lots that are locked off after students park there, so those are the type of situations I'm thinking of.
Understood.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Janet.
Christos, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah, good morning. Thanks, everyone. This is great. My only comment that I have is it's something that I'm dealing with right now. It's more about planning ahead of time in terms of having the adequate infrastructure to begin with. When we look at a site location, you have existing capacity, and based on existing electrical capacity, that is, you can add X amount of AV capable spaces and so forth. If not, then you have to upgrade your switch gears, you have to upgrade your electrical equipment, and perhaps the service that comes to the site. So what I'm trying to kind of think ahead and avoid is piecemealing and coming up with solutions that if you do something now and knowing that as we continue to electrify our buildings, there's going to be higher demand and more demand for electricity. At what point is the right amount, and when do we make the right decisions to make sure we have the right size of conduits or cables, so we don't have to do the work twice, both within our site and also requesting service from the utility company, which can be very costly. It's just a thought I wanted to share to make sure that's been addressed in our planning and thinking as we're going to continue electrifying our buildings.
Yeah, so that was a major issue, at least for me, just thinking about the infrastructure. And in our survey, we found a lot of people worrying about that because schools, we know, I mean, especially older schools, don't have the infrastructure to maybe install anything. And so that's why we went in our, well, a couple things. So we have these exceptions. So there's no local utility power. They'll say, yeah, you can install, we can take that, but it's $25 million. So we definitely are cognizant of that and don't want that to kill projects. And then when we look at the power method, where we're allowing level 1, low power level 2, we feel like this is the best way that we can do to say, hey, we're getting chargers in an infrastructure that's was not necessarily thought of when they installed it. So there's a lot more chargers that can get installed when we use the lower power level. And again, not necessarily in these workshops, the school specific, but in the non-residential workshops that we're jointly held with BSC, is the discussion was very commonly the low power levels are better for charging cars, especially over longer periods of time. It makes the batteries last longer. And specifically in schools, we have students that are on campus for 6 to 8 hours and not going anywhere. So we feel like this solution is going to meet a lot of those issues.
Yeah, thank you. And I was just thinking more about 5-10 years or ahead of time as we continue to increase the amount of electricity that we need and going through that process. So I think that's taken into consideration is going to be very helpful for all of us. Thanks.
Thank you, Christos.
Chris Frankel, you're up.
Hello, everyone. I have a question related to when the EV charging stations are triggered in, say, alterations. Whenever we're doing a project, we have to do path of travel upgrades, which have to go all the way back to the parking lot. And the word alteration in DSA and code languages, can be as simple as modifying, the slope in the parking lot and signage and things like that. So we're trying to do, for instance, a shade structure. We have to do a path of travel as a percentage, but we're going into the parking lot when we're making modifications. Right now, is it just new parking lots, or is there any kind of trigger for alterations to a certain percentage of cost?
So I'm going to, so I believe when we're doing Pat and Eric, you're going to have to help me out here. So I'm not very well versed on the accessibility, but I believe when you're doing a project consisting of just an accessibility improvement in the parking lot, that wouldn't be required. So Eric, are you there?
I am, thank you. So yeah, I believe that, and we may need to massage the language a little bit. But if you are improving the parking area solely because of accessibility reasons, then you would not need to provide accessibility. It is not our intention to add requirements on top of requirement. So if it's only for accessibility, then you would not need to make the EVSEs or EVCS improvements.
May I
Yeah,
add to
Yes,
that?
Ida, please.
Thanks.
It's a
So,
workshop.
yeah, I was reviewing this language, and I want to be clear that in two things. First of all, if you could move up a little bit, Paul, in the language, the alterations are specific, and that is whether you're increasing power to the light fixtures or to the parking lot, or you're installing photovoltaic. So that is specific to the parking lot. So we're not talking about right now any kind of surface repair. We're not going that way.
Repair.
And then the alterations of a building only trigger the requirement to install electric vehicle charging stations if you have EV capable spaces that don't have any charging infrastructure right now. So all the stuff has already been provided. We're just requiring you to actually install the chargers, to activate them. So, and we've triggered it to a project required to be submitted to DSA. So if you have a building on campus somewhere that's undergoing an alteration and that project under IRA 22 is required to be submitted to DSA, we're going to ask you, do you have charging infrastructure on your campus that does not have chargers in it? And if you say yes, we're going to say, okay, because of this alteration, you're going to need to install chargers. And, you know, there's the exceptions that are above still apply. We can talk project specific, but this is a trigger to say you have all this infrastructure already. Let's activate them. Let's get these chargers installed. And then the second thing is, remember that when you install chargers, accessibility is required to those chargers, but in the access code, path of travel improvements don't apply. So the installation, the installing chargers will trigger accessibility requirements to those charging stations, right? In the sense of those charging stations need to be accessible, and there should be an accessible route connecting it to the main entrance. But there are no other path of travel improvements that apply, because path of travel improvements don't essentially apply to parking lots. Parking lots serve a building. Bathrooms don't serve a parking lot. So we are limiting it in that regard. In other words, we're not saying tear up your ground, install charging. If you're tearing up the parking space, install charging. That's not being triggered right now for alterations to facilities. The only time we're asking you to install charging on existing facilities is that you are undertaking a massive electrical project, which includes either the installation of photovoltaic systems, where you can consider the charging from photovoltaics in your figures, and also that you're already undertaking an electrical project. So we want you to, while you're doing that, to consider that charging can be supplied then at the same time. I hope that's clear. Thanks.
Yes, thanks.
Yeah, and again, the EV capable spaces there's not going to be a lot of them. It's not going to be prior to 2019 or 2020 for public schools. So, or maybe 2016. So older facilities aren't going to be required to do that. It's only if EV capable spaces were provided. Eric, do you have another comment?
Yeah. So just to wrap all of that up, and I'd really appreciate the overarching description of the requirements. So if you are undertaking an alteration and there are EV capable spaces, those capable spaces would need to, and those capable spaces already have space on the panel, conduit going out to them. So again, you're just activating them with chargers. The charger installation isn't, in that scenario, isn't what would trigger the restrooms portion of the path of travel improvements. It is absolutely correct that the charger installation would require you to place those chargers on an accessible route. But the original alteration that triggered the chargers actually still, under current code, would require path of travel improvements, or may require path of travel improvements under existing code language. So it's a bit of a web, but we were really purposeful about this language, and not in our efforts to not add requirements on top of existing requirements. In other words, the chargers isn't what's making those accessibility improvements. It's really existing requirements that would make those, that would trigger those. I understand it's sort of a web, but we were really purposeful in that effort. Are there other hands?
Yes, the next person we have is Marie.
Hi, I have a question actually on what you have on the screen right now.
So for the EV charging stations, is that in case we install photovoltaic systems? I mean, sometimes the existing schools are pretty old in which you install the system. So potentially we go into the exemption because the existing, I don't know, Southern California Edison or something does not have a capability for this. But is that starting, I'm sorry, I'm outside. Is it starting in 2023 in January, or is that for the next code over?
So this would be for the intervening code cycle. So I think that would be July of 2024. Yeah.
July 2024. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, if there's an issue with the utility, then yes, those exceptions are there
And
for
this
that.
publication you're showing right now, it's only, it's going to be a separate publication from DSA, or is it going to be part of, I mean, what is this going to be under for us to
This will-
reference it to our clients?
So this will be under the CalGreen code.
Under the
This is
CalGreen
actual
code.
CalGreen. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
And Marie, this is pre-cycle, understanding that this is a pre-cycle workshop, so we really appreciate any input. There of course is there are opportunities moving forward in the rulemaking process to provide public comments as well. A 45-day period, 15-day period, code advisory committees. So there's a number of opportunities to provide feedback between now and when this formally becomes adopted.
Well, I mean, it just so far we understood that the installation of photovoltaic system was not a type of alteration that would actually create the upgrade required to provide the infrastructure for EV, because it was kind of like if you're resurfacing the parking lot, you don't need to do all this, right? So what do you call renovation on campus or not? And so far, it sounds to me like the photovoltaic systems installation was kind of exempt from all this requirement to upgrade or to even provide the empty conduits for future EV install. So it looks like now they're making that a trigger too.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
So prior to this intervening cycle, it would, so 2022 code is not required. 2019 code not required if you're doing PV. But now that's what we're moving towards. If you're going to install PV, we would like to have those chargers installed, or we're going to require those chargers to be installed.
And just to understand that, we're focusing our alterations on when an electrical improvement project is occurring. So it's not intended to trigger additional scope to a project. I mean, technically it does, but again, we have the
DSA already forces us to put ADA parking spaces, accessible parking spaces under the array to provide equal access to shade. So they're already losing a few parking spaces because of that. If now you're also telling them that they need to provide EV charging stations mandatory on their parking lots, some schools are going to say, no, I can't afford to lose 6 parking spaces. I only have 20 parking spaces in my parking lot.
Okay,
and that's
so
not going to work for them.
understand that those parking spaces can be provided with level 1, which then essentially they can be parked all day while they're charging. So they're doing double duty. The choice is to make decisions as to the level of charging you're provided is there within the framework of the code, but we all have a responsibility to advance climate action, to provide equity to our students in having charging available where they may not be having charging available at their residence. I mean, that HCD is working on that as well, but this is to create a charging infrastructure throughout the state of which schools are a part. And so project-specific conditions always need to be brought to DSA to be discussed at pre-application meetings. And there are exceptions in the code that allow us to make exceptions either by alternative means or by waiving the requirement, as long as you're engaging with us in that. But in order to advance charging, we need to provide these requirements in regulation to have that discussion appropriately for each site.
Yeah, I understand. So even a level 1 charging station, you're still going to have to make one of them at least accessible. So you're losing at least 1 parking space for the loading zone, right?
Yes, accessibility is required.
Yeah.
That's required by federal law.
Oh, it is. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I appreciate the comments, and I, as a regulatory agency, I understand the comment that DSA makes you do this. Understand that DSA is also reactive to legislative requirements, federal requirements. All of these are not source. The source of these regulations are ultimately in statute. DSA is absolutely forbidden from creating underground regulations that are not consistent with statute. So appreciate the comment.
Well,
but yes.
I do want to clarify that the regulatory process does not have to be substantiated by statute. It has to be substantiated within our authority, but we don't need legislation that says create EV charging on schools in order to do that. So just clarifying the underground regulation process. Thanks, Eric.
Thank you, Ida.
Yeah, and again, we did try to be equitable in the amount of spaces required for parking lots. So a parking lot that has 20 total spaces would only be required to have one EV charger. So we're not trying to take the whole parking lot with chargers.
And to clarify your point, Marie, when you only have one charger, it's open to everyone. So while it needs to be accessible, correct, and it tends to essentially takes up what could be 2 charging spaces, correct, it is not reserved. It is open to everyone, because when you have less than 4 chargers provided, they're available for everyone.
Okay, Jessica, do we have?
Yes, Mark Geller, you are next.
Hi there. Thanks so much for having this workshop. I just want to simply, I'm from the EV Charging for All Coalition. We've been working with DSA, with BSC and HCD on the codes in general for EV charging. And I just want to basically express our support for what Paul expressed in terms of the value of low power, and particularly of level 1 charging in a situation such as schools, both for staff and for students, including level 1 charging as a appropriate charging option makes total sense. And, you know, it uses much less power. It distributes the power over time. As he said, it's also actually better for the cars. But, you know, lots of low level power as opposed to a little bit of higher level power in this sort of situation makes a tremendous amount of sense. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark.
And it looks like that is all the hands raised.
Okay, so I believe, pull my agenda. So I believe Michelle Golden will take it from me. Thank you, everyone, for your comments. A lot of them were very insightful.
Thank you, Paul.
Hi, everybody. I'm Michelle Golden. I'm a senior architect, as I mentioned, at sustainability. And so my part today is I'd like to present to you the language that we're proposing for carbon reduction regulations. So this is language you haven't seen yet. We've been working on this. I will share my screen so that you can get a first glance at it before we publish it. We're still in the process of making sure that we've covered all our bases, and we've gotten our input from the industry leaders, and let me see if I can do this, and other interested parties to make sure everybody has this. So give me a second, I'll share my screen. I believe it's this one. And hopefully you can see that. Are you seeing my screen?
I can see it, Mickey.
Draft carbon reduction regulations, that's up?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So let me go through this, but before I go through this language so that you get a chance to look at it and digest it a little bit, and then once we have it more finalized, we will publish it so that everyone can review it and give public input. But I did want to cover some of the overarching concepts that we presented in our previous CalGreen for Schools workshop. This wasn't included then because, like I said, we were still working on it in collaboration with industry leaders, other state entities, and we wanted to develop these to a certain level before we introduce them to the public. We are proposing to co-adopt these regulations with the Building Standards Commission. And as I said before, once we get to the rulemaking stage, and we need to provide for public input, we'll publish these initial express terms. These are actually introductory in the sense that they apply really to large projects with a combined square footage that's 50,000 square feet or bigger, whether it's new construction, additions, or alterations. The reason for this is these are projects and design teams that are familiar with some of the terms and some of the requirements that you'll see in the language. And the maximum carbon levels have been required over time as part of the Buy Clean California program, which has been in effect for a few years. And so it's been proven that these can be achievable goals. And also it's mostly the structural elements of the buildings, and then concrete being part of that is achievable as well. But since there's a lot of variety in the regional materials and of concrete and manufacturing cement processes, then we're trying to provide an alternate weighted average calculation so that you can do the same sort of calculations for concrete. So what we'd like to do, and again, before I go through these, is kind of give you an overview. We looked at providing 3 different pathways to compliance. So if you have an alteration or an addition and it qualifies for building reuse, and we'll talk about that further down into the terms, then you can go that direction to verify carbon reduction through material conservation. If you're proposing a new construction of 50,000 square feet or more, then we have 2 other methods for compliance, which are whole building life cycle analysis, which we'll cover in a little more detail in a minute, and prescriptive compliance, which sets global warming or GWP limits, and then they require environmental product declarations, which are EPDs. You'll see that throughout the language for proof of compliance. This may sound intimidating, but you also have to realize most architects that design these big projects are familiar and adept at using EPDs, and there is free software as well as paid software that's provided by companies to be able to calculate whole building life cycle assessments. These projects that are this size also, there's data that proves that you can provide projects, and there are projects that are products available that will meet our Buy Clean California standards shown in the California Buy Clean California Act. And so those don't really increase project costs because these are products that have been around for a while. You may see a slight increase in design fees just because there's a little bit more homework attached to coming up with these calculations and some input in what products work better than others. But this we anticipate to be less than 1% in that total design fee. So it's not a huge cost, and it may not even be a cost at all. The built environment, just for those of you who are saying, why do we need to reduce carbon? You have to realize too that the built environment constitutes 40% of carbon emissions in the planet, and we all have a responsibility to address that and reduce the carbon emissions that are currently going on, especially as there's more and more construction that continues. And a building that doesn't address that goes up today will emit more carbon during the construction of that building. If we don't pay attention to it, then it will the rest of its lifetime, which is, you know, considered a fairly long service life. And it will also keep emitting the carbon for the next 20 years. So we have this technology available. We're able to now look at creating net zero buildings. So this is the logical next step in becoming more sustainable. And because this is an introduction to regulations that no one has seen yet, because these are sections that were reserved in the codes, but not really fleshed out to any degree, you know, this is what we want to start with the larger buildings, and then we also will start incrementally applying it to projects that are smaller in future cycles. But this gives everybody a chance to get familiar with what we have and you know, get set to start incorporating these strategies and technologies into smaller buildings. And so with that said, I have the reduction regulations up. These are our initial express terms. Let me go down a little bit to get you to something you can look at. And what I would like to try and do is summarize basically what each section is, rather than spend all of my time reading to you these specific sections. You can do that once we publish them. And if you have questions again, you know, please, you're always able to contact us at DSA as we go through the public forums to get these into regulations. So first thing we want to do is we want to add the definitions to section 202 in the CalGreen codes. These are terms that you see through the industry with respect to carbon reduction. Some of them may be familiar, some of them may not. Buy Clean California Act's been around for a bit. And so that's fairly familiar, I would think. It really just covers the maximum acceptable global warming potential limits for carbon emissions from 4 basic materials. That's what we're looking at in these regulations, those being structural steel, concrete reinforcing steel, flat glass, and mineral wool board insulation. And these were established by DGS in conjunction with CARB, California Air Resources Board. Some of the terms that may be less familiar would be cradle to gate, which is basically the activities or processes associated with the product or building's life cycle from extraction through production of the materials. And then if you look at these ISO standards, it gives you more detail on how that all comes about. Cradle to grave is actually the process and activities that are associated with the product or building's life cycle, from extraction of the elements to make the materials through the disposal and end of service life for the building. And so those again are also covered, but they're two similar, but yet one is more of an extension of the other term. Then we have EPDs, which are environmental product declarations. These are actually third-party verified reports that summarize how product impacts the environment. There's different types, 3 main types that we've outlined in the code sections, which is product specific, which basically is how the product is made, factory specific, which is impacts that are attributed to a single manufacturer and manufacturing facility. And then we have industry-wide EPDs, which are, and these are all classified under type 3 because they're third-party verified, is that these are products that have a typical manufacturing impact for a lot of products within the same type of category. So for example, concrete, because there's a lot of different types of concrete for a group of manufacturers. So we try to put these in. Reference study period is the period of use for the building, or in other words, a service life. That's in years that we assume for life cycle assessment. And typically that's right around 60 years, if I remember correctly. So that's the first section. These are the definitions. And you'll see a few more in another section, but basically these are what we use to describe all the different regulatory language for carbon reduction. So the next section is section 5.105. This was originally reserved with no regulatory language, but now we've opened it up and we're proposing to put this in here, deconstruction and reuse of existing structures. So this really falls to building reuse. So the scoping that you see here, section 5.105.1 specifies the size parameters for alterations and additions to existing buildings. Again, with that combined area of 50,000 square feet or more. These, once you get to this point of square footage, it will trigger mandatory requirements to show compliance to one of the 3 proposed pathways that we'll talk about. This is one for existing buildings, and it gives you a chance to maintain parts and elements of an existing building. And you can verify your carbon reduction using reusing these different materials and installation. So that leads into section 5.105.2, which is the reuse of existing buildings. And then to use this method, it really only falls to additions or alterations of buildings, and those 2 types of projects will be required to maintain at least 45% of the existing primary structural system and building enclosure. Unless, of course, you have something that's either hazardous or unsound, and then we will not allow you to use, we won't allow you to use those type of elements or materials. Evidence of compliance will be required to be part of the construction documents. So we've put language into, or we're proposing language for those things. Verification of this compliance will have to be on the construction documents. And then to help you along, we are in the process of working on worksheets that will be attached to the sections and the chapter so that you have a sense of how to go about providing this compliance. And it will be required when it comes in and you submit to DSA for a project. Let me scoot down to the next one. Deconstruction is somewhat reserved, but we did go ahead and, what do I have here? We're adding to that. If we add language to this, then we will have that published along with the IET forms. But at this point, we're still working on that. Section 5.401.1 is scoping again for just in general for carbon reduction. And so what we propose to do is add the phrases to specify the requirements to achieve greenhouse gas emission reduction. So that GHG is a greenhouse gas. And we want to provide those requirements to reduce that to the existing scoping that's in place in this section. And how we are going to accomplish that is add the phrase installation of projects with lower GHG emissions as part of that requirement that's already in place in the code. Section 504.2, let me scroll down a little bit to that. We have these other definitions that fall with the other pathways to carbon reduction and verification. You can see those there. They're essentially the same one by Clean California Act, cradle to grave, the EPDs and the different types of EPDs. Organic waste is existing and test is existing. Anything you see here that's not underlined has already been in the section, and so there's no changes to that. Scrolling on then to 5.408, which is construction waste reduction. There's a few minor changes to that. And I know this is a lot for everybody. So if we get through this, we can always cycle back and go through questions to this. So what we propose to do is just change some language here to deconstruct. It's a better overall descriptor of what you want to do with existing materials that you may not be able to use. And we're going to change that to deconstruct or recycle as opposed to recycle and or salvage. it just gives a better description of the methodology for the management of that waste. And then going down into 409, these are actually the two, this is the first of the other two pathways that you can pursue in order to verify this. These, I believe, can be used for existing buildings, but they're typically more in tune with what you would want to possibly go with in verification for a new construction that's 50,000 square feet or more. So starting with the scoping, which is 5.409.1. We propose to add this section to outline the parameters for new construction. Again, possibly additional and alteration projects with that combined floor area of 50,000. And these types of projects, again, will trigger that mandatory requirement to show the verified carbon reduction compliance by using this specific method that we'll outline in just a second of life cycle analysis. So that puts us into section 5.409.2, which is whole building life cycle assessment. What this is that this is a methodology for determining the whole building life cycle assessment of a proposed project. And we have these ISO standards, they're data sets. I won't go through all those, but those govern how this can be accomplished. And so it also we'll go through how compliance can be verified within the following subjects. One thing to note with this, before you throw up your hands and think, how are we supposed to do this, is that there is software that's applicable to calculating whole building life cycle assessments that's available. There's free versions that have been around for years, such as Tally. There's also paid versions that probably would go more in depth, but you do have some choices there. And we are also, again, working on sample worksheets that will be developed and added to the code section for assistance in figuring out how to use this method to demonstrate compliance. These will be available for public input and review at a future date. We're still working on those to make sure we got the optimal worksheets to make everyone's life so much easier doing this. So basically, you will take these different materials and you can run through the software. It will give you numbers, that will tell you how you're impacting the global warming potential, and there's allowable maximums, and you demonstrate that you're not exceeding those allowable maximums. That would also lead into the second of the other, or a third option for calculating your carbon reduction, which is section 5.409.3, which is called, and let me scroll down to that. And again, I didn't want to read you every word here. We'd be here all day. But you can see with section 5.409.2, we give you components, reference study period, and how to verify that. And then we've got some notes there, which we just talked about, software and sample worksheets that we'll put out there as soon as we get those resolved and to a point that we're happy with them. So moving into 5.409.3, which is product GWP, global warming potential compliance. It's a prescriptive pathway. We propose to add the section, and we'll outline the parameters for using a prescriptive approach to compliance to carbon reduction. This really is meant for new construction. Possibly you could use it for any other type, but it's using product specific or factory specific type 3 EPDs, which are not able or not allowed to exceed the maximum GWP values listed in a table that we propose to add to the section to make, again, it consistent and easier for everyone to use. So As mentioned earlier, it's the steel products, glass and insulation, it's concrete reinforcing steel, structural steel, flat glass, and the wool, mineral wool fiber insulation are the limits that are going to be made available. And they're also the same limits that have been used in the Buy Clean California Act for several years, so it shouldn't be any surprise to anyone. The only exception that you would have, because as I mentioned earlier, concrete has a lot of variety into it as far as mixes and methodology. So we propose a weighted average to use, which is the sum of all your concrete mixes that you're going to use for the project. And then you take that weighted average, and we give you a calculation within this section that you can use to determine it. You can see it right here, equation 5.409.3.2. It looks scarier than it is, but it actually, if you look through it, it's very simple. It's essentially you're taking the different types of concrete mixes and methodology, putting them together, calculating a weighted average, and then that number is the number that we would actually be looking at for compliance against the allowed maximum in the table that will be provided in the code. Then there's subsections, like I said, here's the one for the equation. Let's go down a little bit more. And then you've got verification. So verification for these methods of compliance are going to be required in a project on the construction documents. They'll be required for submittal. Updated EPDs will be provided, as you can see, basically this one, it says updated EPDs for the products used in the construction shall be provided to the owner at close of construction and then to the enforcement entity. So probably your inspectors would be getting these updated EPDs. Something to think about is that EPDs tend to be updated every 5 years. So if you have long-term projects, it might be something to keep in the back of your head. So we are going to add this table. And we'll also have, again, some sample worksheets that will attach for assisting you to figure out if you choose to go down this prescriptive path, you can use our worksheets. And again, those are in the process, just like the other worksheets, so that you get the best possible worksheets to be able to use. So you can see here, we're ending this particular section with a table. Everybody's so quiet. With the limits that we consider to be the maximum acceptable limits, and then the unit of measurement they come in, and the category. And you can see, looking at the table on the screen, that it's sectioned into the let me just look at these first. So we have the 4 building elements we've been talking about throughout the section, which are the structural steel, reinforcing steel, glass, and the insulation. And then you can see, going down further in the table, that we also have looked at some varieties of concrete ready mix versus early strength versus lightweight, to give you some numbers there. And those you can use in the weighted average to measure against. And so, and basically the last note that we want to add is that these GWP values, in case you're wondering where they came from, are based on 175% of the Buy Clean California Act values, which don't include concrete, but those we have gotten from, we're using different values. And again, you can use them in a weighted average. So those are from the EPDs, the industry-wide EPDs, because it's a variety of things within the same product. And then you can see, we also have specified that high early strength ready mix concrete is based on 130% of the ready mix concrete GWP values, as opposed to the 175 listed above. So that's the carbon reduction section, basically, in a very big nutshell. And is there any questions?
Chris Frankel, you are up.
So does the DWP apply to values apply to existing buildings or only new buildings?
I believe they apply, I would imagine they would apply to both existing and new buildings, with the respect that the new buildings would have the capacity to be able to, choose their materials based on EPDs, but existing buildings, you're kind of there with what you got, so.
Right, so
No,
one of
actually,
the,
to clarify, the existing buildings can choose all three options. So they can choose to reuse existing structures, one option, and if not, anything new that's added would fall into the EPDs.
so we wouldn't have to try to quantify the existing carbon under these, let's say.
No, if you're choosing to reuse your existing building and that's the way you're meeting this requirement, it's just in the demonstration of meeting 45% of the existing building structure. And then you wouldn't have to, you would be encouraged to add the, consider the EPDs, but in this initial step, you would fulfill the requirement by the reuse of the existing building. If you don't choose that option, anything you add new into the project would need to meet the EPDs.
Okay.
And or the whole building life cycle analysis.
Yeah, so that it's a challenge. I'm working on an 85-year-old gym that doesn't have some of these criteria. It's a different criteria that when it was built. So if I had to go down that analysis, it would be hard to find a spot that it would fit into categories based on current construction. So thank you for clarifying.
Understood. Excuse me for interrupting, Michelle, sorry.
It's okay, because you're right. I mean, it makes more sense if you got an existing building, you would want to use the building reuse pathway versus the other two, simply by virtue that you don't know what you're working with. And in your case, if you're working with an older building, it would be very hard to quantify anything. So that makes a lot of sense. And that's one of the reasons why we gave 3 pathways, is to give you a little bit of flexibility as far as being able to verify your carbon reduction.
And Mickey, if I could just, before we go on to the next question, an alteration can use all 3. Still has the option of all 3 pathways. Perhaps you're not able to save, or the portion of the existing building that is salvageable doesn't meet the 45% requirement, and so then you have the ability to use either of the other 2 pathways.
Should I take Aaron's question? Aaron? Jessica, I'm jumping.
Thank you.
I see Aaron.
Might I suggest a revision to the name? I've run into a lot of confusion on this when people are first coming up on this, and I personally feel like having embodied carbon or similar in the name for the statute would clear a lot of that up just in the initial Google searches. Have you guys considered something along those lines for clarity?
Eric, do you want to? I'll defer to you as far as that goes.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the comment. Is your comment rooted in the differentiation between the types of carbon and like embodied versus operational? Is that the sort of the root?
Precisely.
Okay, understood. Yeah, thank you for your comment. We are proposing to co-adopt this with building standards. So while I wouldn't necessarily commit in this meeting today, we appreciate the comment.
And we have no other hands up.
Okay, well then if there's no more questions, I'll move on to the CO2 monitoring. So let me pull up those express terms. Bear with me for just a second. And let me share my screen one more time, hopefully. Is it up? Not sure if it is or not. Jessica.
I'm saying section 301.4.
Item 2. So you can see this on my screen. Anyone? Can you see my
Sorry,
screen?
yes,
Item
yes,
two?
Vicky, I can see
Oh,
it.
thank you. I wasn't sure because it's not telling me. So with item 2, and Paul has already presented, we've got some changes to scoping here. And what we wanted to do is also look at scoping and some changes to the current CO2 monitoring requirements that are for newly built classrooms. These are already in the regulatory language. We did this the previous cycle. And in that cycle, we talked about and proposed language for newly constructed classrooms. And this goes to indoor air quality, and it's the addition of the requirement for CO2 monitors within the classrooms so that staff and teachers can identify any concerns with the air. There's a set of requirements that are in section 5.506.3. But as these only pertain to new classrooms, we are now proposing in this code cycle to extend that to alterations and additions of classroom buildings. So to that point, on item 2, we've added in a line item under 301.4.2, which also is the requirement for alterations and also additions, I believe, that those existing classrooms, if having work done, shall comply with those same sections that apply to the requirements for CO2 monitors in newly built classrooms. And that's it in a nutshell. Any questions?
Andrew Groff, you're up.
Hi, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thank you. Yes, Andrew Groff on behalf of Western States Council of Sheet Metal Workers. I just wanted to say that we are in support of the options, the extension of standards for the carbon dioxide monitors in classrooms. Studies have shown that even new classrooms and alterations are commonly underventilated, and that negatively impacts student health and learning and increases the risk of airborne disease transmission. And continuous real-time carbon dioxide monitoring can be used to detect and correct these problems. And so this solution, we believe, can maximize transparency and increase the confidence and the adequacy of school ventilation systems. So we are in support of these changes. Thank you.
Great, thank you for the support.
Eric, go ahead.
Thank you. Nikki, I'd like to maybe take the opportunity. I meant to clarify one point on the carbon reduction, if you wouldn't mind scrolling to section 5.105.3.
Pull it up. The deconstruction.
Correct. Yeah. So there was a comment earlier about the naming of it. Part of the naming is that there was existing language in CalGreen where these requirements are being inserted into, and I think Mickey did a great job of describing that. The term deconstruction is in the title of that existing language, and so sorry if you could go back to that. So it was important to include a reserve space for 5.105.3 for future use. We don't have any intention during the intervening cycle of utilizing or filling in any language for that section. It's simply a placeholder for future rulemaking cycles. And then, so that was just one point of the one point of clarification I wanted to make. And then thank you for the support on the carbon dioxide. Are there other hands raised before I?
There are no other hands.
Okay, thank you. So it probably is a good, thank you for the support on the CO2 monitoring. This will serve as our transition into the next agenda item, since there are no other hands, which is the all-gender multi-user restrooms agenda item. However, before I move on to that, it would probably be appropriate now to go over three recent pieces of legislation that have been signed. And I know I mentioned that a lot of our requirements, all of our requirements are rooted in legislation, or as I had clarified, our authority to create those regulations. But three important bills that were signed by the governor in the last day or two relate either directly or indirectly to the provisions that you're seeing today. And in regards to the CO2 monitoring, let me pull up the correct number so that I'm not misstating it, and I will share. Let me just share my screen.
Thank you.
And I'll quickly cover these three pieces of legislation, but want to encourage you to do your research on them, but they have recently been signed. And so it is Assembly Bill 2232, which relates to the CO2 monitoring. And this does direct both BSC and the state architect to propose for adoption mandatory standards for carbon dioxide monitors in classrooms of covered schools. And then it encourages the University of California to do the same. These are really important pieces of legislation and requirements within California Green Code for a safe, healthy environment for our schools and students. So that is one that we believe we are slightly ahead of the curve on this one, in that the legislation is requiring it upon the next triennial, but DSA, of course, is given the opportunity to review legislation as it's being developed, and decided to take these small steps to include CO2 monitoring in alterations in addition to what you will see in the 2022 triennial cycle that will become effective in January 1. So January 1, it's new classrooms. And once we hit July 1, 2024, it'll be alterations. So that's a recent bill. And somewhat related, some sort of indirectly, is another bill that was recently signed, Assembly Bill 1738. Now this deals more directly with HCD and Building Standards Commission, but it does direct the future inclusion of EVCS or charging facilities in existing facilities. So you can certainly do your homework on those, but those are two recent bills signed in, hot off the press news, perhaps in this meeting. And then lastly, this will serve as a good transition to our next item. And this is Senate Bill 1194, again signed, I believe, last night. This probably would tell me. When it's signed. I'm not looking at the sign date, but I believe it was signed as of last night. But this would authorize local jurisdictions to allow, and I want to focus on the word allow for a moment. I know that we've received, and Building Standards Commission has received a lot of comments and concerns that these are mandatory requirements for multi-use or all gender facilities. It's simply an allowance to be able to provide those. It is not requiring all gender multi-user restrooms in all facilities or all new facilities. It is simply an allowance for. And this legislation is directed to local jurisdictions. However, because DSA, CDE, and many have identified that the existing prohibition built into the plumbing code of all gender multi-use or all gender facilities, it has created a significant inequity amongst our students across and others across the state. And so it is being allowed for through this legislation, or it allows a local jurisdiction essentially to ignore those specific requirements and provides some language for their ability to allow for or include requirements specific to multi-user all gender facilities. So I will take questions and comments about this, but I just wanted to get that those three pieces of legislation out there, and then perhaps use that as a transition into our next topic. So pardon me while I stop share and get the correct screen on. Oh, was I not sharing those?
No.
Oh, goodness. Folks, you can feel free. So let me share those again. Okay, so with respect to Senate Bill 1194, you can find those on this webpage, the legal info legislature.ca.gov. There's a good search. It gets you right to the bill text. I use it frequently. And then the CO2 monitoring is Assembly Bill 2232. And with respect to the electric vehicle charging stations, that is, sorry, it's Assembly Bill 1738. So now I'll stop sharing that and get the appropriate thing up. And now I seem to, oh, there's my controls here.
We have Aaron with his hand up.
I suppose, sure. Yeah,
thank
we can go to comments, absolutely. While I transition, thank you.
So, while I am not unsympathetic to the social reasons for the all gender restrooms, I would just like to note that we see a serious increase in the expected water use when we move to all gender and single occupant restrooms without urinals. Right, there's a big difference in the flush rate between the current practice of 1.125 gallons per flush in urinals versus 1.0 or 1.1 or 1.2 for water closets. I don't know that this is necessarily a code issue. I think it really probably does belong in the design teams, and I've worked with many of my teams to try to address this issue. But perhaps, when you guys are writing the code and considering what to allow, or, the code always does its best to encourage designers for the proper solutions. I really would encourage the group writing code to keep that in mind for this. We can expect a large increase in water use for restrooms without urinals, and we should not forget that.
Thank you, Aaron. And again, even within multi-user all gender facilities, there is no requirement to eliminate urinals. We do recognize that there is an increase in water usage, certainly from a waterless urinal to a standard water closet. But as you noted, there is a difference in the flush rates for standard urinals over standard water closets as well. So it was important for us to not exclude the ability to have a design provide urinals. There's a privacy issue that the designer would need to take into account for, but that is inherent in the design itself, not in the code requirement. But I appreciate the comment. We'll continue to monitor that as the regulations progress. I will say that there is as well a triennial cycle where we do anticipate changes to the model code to become more in line with what these requirements are allowing for. That prohibition exists in the model code, and these changes would rectify that. So all of that being said, oops, I'm sharing the wrong file. Thank you. So as I mentioned, the model code currently has well, it's an explicit prohibition, and I think we talked about this this in our last working group. And that is that it requires separate facilities. So while in the sequence of the code, you come across a fixture count before you enter into before you get into the separate facilities requirement, it's really embedded in this section, and I'll just skip forward a little bit. It's in the prohibition is embedded into this section in the plumbing code, which explicitly says separate toilet facilities shall be provided for each sex. From that moment on, there are some existing exceptions, but they tend to ignore the multi-user potential, and so the new requirements that will be added the new exceptions that will be added allow for a designer to provide separate facilities. So explicitly, it just is an exception again to this. It's not a requirement, it's an exception to the rule, which says that separate facilities shall not be required where rooms have fixtures designed for use by all genders and water closets are installed in privacy compartments. When installed, this speaks to your water usage comment. When installed, urinals shall be located in a privacy compartment or separate private area. And then this exception number 5, the substitution of a water closet for each urinal shall be permitted, provided the total number of fixtures and stalls complies with 422.1. Now, this could suggest an increase in water use, and so we're certainly interested in specific comments that you might have on that. But again, this is not a requirement to eliminate urinals. It just simply allows for the elimination or the replacement of a water closet for a urinal. So let me go up, and I'll go the other location that you'll find more of it's not really even a suggestion. It's how you calculate the number of fixtures, and that is has always been in table 422.1 a couple of columns, one for men and one for women, and so the all gender multi-user fixtures requirements, or the changes to that section, are simply saying take the sum total of all of those and provide the appropriate number of facilities equal to that sum. Under the men's column of that table, you will see urinals, and so those urinals would need to, as I stated, would need to be a 1-to-1 replacement and included in the water fixture calculation. So I think the changes are fairly straightforward, so I won't sit here and go through the entire thing, but the key concepts are that this will allow for an exception. It's not a requirement. It's an exception to providing separate facilities, and that the total sum calculation, the calculation of the water fixtures, is the sum total of all of the fixtures required by the existing tables. And again, we do anticipate some shift in the model code in the triennial, which would perhaps drive some amendments in California as well. So I'll stop there and ask for questions.
Chris Frankel, go ahead.
So is this only what's proposed by DSA? Obviously DSA is, you guys are DSA and you're proposing this. Is this
Thank you
specifically
for asking.
related to schools only?
We are co-adopting with Building Standards Commission, so it would be for non-residential as well. And I believe Kevin Day is on the line. Kevin, I'll give you the opportunity to clarify any misstatements I have, but we are co-adopting with Building Standards Commission.
That's correct. Thanks, Eric. And for the benefit of the group, the Building Standards Commission's co-adoption of this exception to the separate facilities for all gender multi-user restrooms would be applicable to our authority under the BSC banner, which is state buildings, state colleges, and university buildings. So just to clarify that. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you.
You're welcome, Chris.
And there are no other hands up.
Okay. Well, let me, and there are no questions on the calls either, correct?
Doesn't look like it.
Okay. So that brings us to, I believe you can see the agenda on my screen. Is that correct, Jessica?
Yes.
Okay. So as predicted, I thought we might enter a bit or end a bit early, and we're about 2 hours in. That brings us to our next steps. Mid-October, as I mentioned earlier, we will be submitting to OLS our rulemaking, our express terms, our ISORs, initial statement of reasons, and our 399s, which are our financial analysis of all the proposed code provisions. Those are due mid-October. I think October 15th has been the published date. DSA will be submitting that earlier, and I know there's internal reviews that will be occurring before even that date. So in a very short time, we'll be advancing these. That does not mean that the revisions stop. There could be minor revisions to these. Certainly, once the 399s become approved, the ability to make major changes that may affect cost really diminishes. But that does not mean that public comment stops. We will be receiving comments during the Building Standards Commission's Code Advisory Committee period. We'll be receiving comments during the 45-day period, and we'll be receiving comments during the 15-day periods in the intervening cycle. We certainly are open to receiving any comments that you have on any of these at any time during that process, and would really look forward to receiving comments. It really will help to build a stronger, more effective code, and certainly be equitable. So please send any comments you have to you. You certainly can send them to me, and I stipulated my email address earlier. But you can also send them to our DGS Sustainability shared mailbox. Jessica, do you have that specific mailbox name? If not, we can.
I do not, but I can get it for you.
I believe it's DGS HQ Sustainability. .ca.gov. Or so while she's doing that, that is our next steps, and I would see if anybody has any questions on that.
We have no hands up.
Okay, other than mine, which I'm struggling to take down right now. Okay, so in lieu of that, sorry to put you on the spot, Jessica. I realize you're multitasking and trying to pull up the information. We will make sure to post on our rulemaking page the appropriate email addresses, but you can also always send those comments to me. We're happy to receive them in any shape, form you forward them to us. So today, I think we had about 50 attendees in our first workshop. We had maybe twice that. So we really, really, truly appreciate everybody's involvement. These have been really successful. I think some of the largest groups we've seen. So we really value the input that we've received during these meetings and look forward to continued support from all of our stakeholders and constituents. And with that, if there are no further comments from DSA staff, Ida, Mia?
And from me, thank you everyone for joining.
Thanks so much, Eric.
Yeah,
Thanks,
great
everyone.
feedback. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mia. Well, I hope everybody has a wonderful weekend and you are able to get out and enjoy this weather. Bye-bye.